The broad ligament, it extends from the lateral border of the uterus, which is convex border of both sides, and going laterally to be attached with the lateral pelvic wall. And this ligament having different parts. This is uterine tube, right? And this is ligament of ovary. If you see from posterior side, this is ligament of ovary. So in between these two, this part of the broad ligament is called the mesosalpinx. Salpinx means uterine tube. So uterine tube will be one of the content of the broad ligament. This one. And this is ligament of ovary. So this part is the mesosalpinx. And from the ovary and from the infundibular part of the uterine tube, from there to lateral pelvic wall, form a ligament called suspensory ligament of ovary or infundibulopelvic ligament. Next part, below the ligament of ovary, this is ligament of ovary. So below the ligament of ovary, this part is the larger or largest part of the broad ligament called mesometrium. So mesentery of the uterus called mesometrium, and its lower border, it is related with the upper border of the McIntosh ligament. And another important part of the broad ligament is the mesovarium. That means this peritoneal fold from the posterior layer of peritoneal fold extends up to the anterior border of the ovary. That part is called the mesovarium. Now look at this diagram. Here you can see the broad ligament. It is having anterior layer and posterior layer. In between these two layers, in the upper part, you will get the uterine tube. And you can also see the ovary in between this anterior and posterior layer of broad ligament below the uterine tube. So ovary in between the two layers. Then what happens? Then look at this next picture. In this picture, in the second drawing, you can see the ovary is in between the anterior and posterior layer of broad ligament, but the ovary as if it is pushing the posterior layer of broad ligament and it is trying to come out of the posterior layer of this broad ligament. In this diagram, you see the ovary, it is pushing the posterior layer of broad ligament and it is almost out of the two layers. That means the ovary, it is connected with the posterior layer of broad ligament at one place. In this picture, in the fourth diagram, you see the ovary, it is outside the two layers of broad ligament, and the anterior border of the ovary, it is connected with the posterior layer of the broad ligament by means of a stalk, and that is called the mesovarium. It acts as a mesentery of the ovary, so the name is mesovarium, and mesovarium is a part of the broad ligament through which the ovarian vessels enter into the ovary to supply the ovary. One thing you might have noticed that in the fourth diagram, the ovary, it is outside the two layers of broad ligament. So the anterior border of the ovary, it is connected with the posterior layer. So that side, it is lined by the mesothelial lining of the peritoneum, but the rest of the surface of the ovary, it is lined by the germinal epithelium, that means the cuboidal epithelium. So at the junction of this mesothelial and the germinal layer of cuboidal epithelium, that transitional zone is called the line of Fourier. So now we know that the ovary, it is behind the posterior layer of the broad ligament and connected to it by the mesovarium. So parts of broad ligament from above downwards, one is mesosalpinx, then continuation to lateral side called suspensory ligament of ovary or infundibulopelvic ligament. Then below it is the mesometrium, the largest part of the broad ligament, and behind the peritoneum, posterior layer of peritoneum is the mesovarium, extending from the posterior layer of peritoneum to the anterior border of the ovary called the mesovarium. Then come to what are the contents of this broad ligament. Broad ligament having two layers, I told you, one is anterior layer, one is posterior layer. So between these two layers of broad ligament, there are so many structures, and one structure you know, that is uterine tube. If it is uterine tube and this is a peritoneum or broad ligament, it is covering the anterior and posterior side over the uterine tube. So uterine tube will be in between the two layers of broad ligament, in the uppermost part of the broad ligament, and below, between these two layers, there are so many structures. And if I tell you very simply or simplified way, it is easier to memorize what are the structures in the broad ligament or between the two layers of broad ligament. I told you one thing, that is, one is uterine tube. Then other structures, you remember two. There will be two ligaments, two nerves, two arteries like this. What are these two, or rule of two? One is uterine tube, you know. What are these two? The two ligaments. One is, you know, that is round ligament in its proximal part, and the ligament of ovary posteriorly. Then two vessels. One is the uterine artery or uterine vessels, and the other one is the ovarian vessels. Then two nerves or two nerve plexus. One is uterovaginal plexus, one is ovarian plexus. Then two embryological remnants. One is the tubules and duct of euphoron. The tubules of euphoron, cephalic end, they join together to form a horizontal duct called the duct of euphoron, or called Gardner's duct. Gardner duct is the cephalic remnant of mesonephric duct. And another embryological element is the tubules of paraphoron. So tubules and duct of euphoron and tubules of paraphoron, these two are the embryological remnant which are the content of broad ligament. And two miscellaneous structures, and these are the lymphatics, lymph vessels and lymph nodes, and some second one is some areolar tissue. So all these structures are the contents of the broad ligament.